Добрый вечер. Разрешите начать наш круглый стол с представления участников. Во-первых, круглый стол организован школой МАРШ и в рамках проекта «Архитектура и контекст». И гостем школы МАРШ является Егуда, Сафран, архитектурный критик, теоретик, скульптор, преподаватель и консультант архитектора Стивена Холла. Еще у нас принимает участие в дискуссии ректор архитектурной школы МАРШ, архитектор Евгений Викторович и Анна Броновицкая, историк архитектуры и, наверное, один из лучших специалистов по советскому модернизму в настоящий момент. И Сергей, Ситар, теоретик архитектуры и архитектор, с кем мы сделали один замечательный проект. И сегодня мы попробуем обсудить модернизм с точки зрения, во-первых, его будущего, и с точки зрения того, что мы на самом деле живем в будущем того модернизма, который когда-то появился. И обсуждение будет на английском языке. So, I think we will start speaking in English. I have introduced. Yeah, okay, that's good. So, we had a preliminary discussion of what modernism is and where we can start to understand its period. And Yehuda suggested that it appears in the 4th century AD, and when the term modern was coined by the philosopher Cassiodorus.
Priest.
Priest, yeah. So, if you would follow the discussion, maybe you can develop this idea and elaborate on it.
Well, why don't you start from the far end and then go from the far end?
Okay. Yehuda is suggesting for you to start, Sergey, and maybe he will react afterwards.
Me as a guest.
Yeah.
Well, we've already tackled this issue in a preliminary while waiting for our speakers, and apparently there are many kind of different positions and different ways of dating the beginning of modernism. Well, quite common opinion is that we can think of its beginning occurring somewhere in the middle of 19th century, while, for example, the independent art scene is appearing in Europe. Then, of course, what comes to mind is the famous chorale des Anciens et Modernes in Paris in the 17th century. And that was a point of revision of the previous orientation towards antiquity. And actually, for the first time, the idea that contemporary architects can somehow excel over the ancients, make something better than ancient did, and then we can proceed all the way down, in my mind, all the way down to Ten Commandments. Because my view of modernism is that what differs modernism from, let's say, what happened after and what modernism was opposed to, what was happening before, let's say in the second half of the 19th century, is well, modernism actually openly professed the possibility of a kind of universal agenda, universal, let's say, search for truth, and to some extent, its ability to practice the truth in let's say, architectural practice in other fields. And the possibility of a universal agenda, the possibility of holding to this kind of universal truth is always, throughout the course of human history, is always questioned. And in later years, let's say in the period that continues up to this point, this possibility is, I think, really heavily questioned. We live in a time when any ambition to find a kind of universal answer to any question is considered a totalitarian illusion. And this, I think, what we have to discuss somehow, because in this situation, actually, to my mind, the theory becomes meaningless. And in these terms, modernism can be opposed to postmodernism as let's say, a more kind of theoretical stance is opposed to a more practical stance and more kind of opportunistic attitude. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a theoretician, I'm a historian, architectural historian, so I tend to respect more narrow limits. And maybe some of you remember that in 2014, the Venice Biennale was curated by raмках, and it was dedicated to the 100 years of architectural modernism, and its emblem was this domino system designed by Le Corbusier at 1914. And I think that the First World War was really this beginning, because this mass destruction and massacre of thousands, I don't know, hundreds of thousands or even millions of people was a moment after which the aims of architecture and aims of construction shifted towards the construction of a new world, not only the revolutionary Russia or Red Vienna, but also in more conservative countries, because they also, there was an understanding that it is impossible to carry on as before if such catastrophes occur. So, modernism, for me, in architecture, yes, it can or might not be technological breakthrough. Modernist architecture can use quite traditional methods of construction, but it aims to create new typologies, new uses, and new systems for living, new ways of organizing space for inhabiting by people and by humankind. It's something that ultimately wanted to give, well, maximum possible benefits to maximum possible number of people. And I also think that modernism is a historical phenomenon that has ended. It left us some values, some approaches that still continue to be relevant and may be relevant for some time, maybe thousands of years. And On the other hand, modernism may be a continuation of some trends and some ideas they did exist for thousands of years, of course. But historically, it starts about 1914 and ended at about 1980. Thank you.
Okay, I will follow. I'm also not a theoretician and not even the historian. I don't know from which point to look at this matter. Let me look at it from the point of view of practitioner. And from this point of view, we can discuss modernism most in terms of formal language. So because all technological and social ideas, as we see for the last 20, 30 years, the ideas which historically belonged to modernistic ideology are perfectly realized in architectural language, which has nothing in common with the ideas of formal language of modernism. If we look at postmodern movement and deconstructivists and so on and so on. So if we look very, very narrow, in a very narrow gap, what modernism is from the point of view of practitioner, it is a very particular architectural language which is based on simple forms, on simple geometry, on the very specific views of using of materials, technologies, and so on. So if we, in a word, from my point of view, what is classical modernism is what was called international style, which was finally established as the international style for the whole 20th century, almost the whole 20th century, and which survived after many dramatic turns, which happened the last, as I said, last 30 years. But finally, we can discuss, if we are discussing the future of modernism, in this discussion, is this form of language still alive? Will it survive for the next centuries, or it already history, and we will never come back to this language which was developed by Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, Gropius, and starting from Russian constructivists, and so on and so on. So this is, maybe it's a very provocative point of view, but I think that it's something which is interesting to discuss. No, you have to.
Yeah. It's on. No. I can use Okay.
No? It's not?
No.
It should be
Okay. So, well, thank you for coming here this afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to join you. I'm very pleased with the company of MARSH, a school that I only knew from publication, but now I've seen some of their work, both in the school and down here in the introductory exhibition of positive negatives. So it's a great privilege. I've been in Moscow many times under Gorbachev, and I must say that in the period since, the town is almost unrecognizable, and largely because of Pomon, because of a lot of postmodernist kind of facades have been erected, and it looked more like a kind of a scenography for some kind of somebody said the kind of nouveau riche town, it feels like this, it behaves like this, and so on. Now, against this background, of course, all these issues have different meanings, especially when some of the most powerful modernist input occurred in this environment long before the revolution, especially with the Russian formalists, above all in linguistics, which opened up a way of thinking which made possible the constructivists, which are infected in this way, strangely enough, are connected with deconstructivists. Indeed, many people in the West sometimes mistakenly looking for literature and constructivists, thinking that it is part of what is called deconstruction. The fault is of one man that probably unknown to most of you, called Edmund Husserl, who created a philosophy that enabled the Russian linguists to develop their kind of thinking, which eventually, in a roundabout way, directly influenced the deconstructivist above all. I mean, you cannot imagine the early work of Frank Gehry without the ostronymy, without the estrangement technique, the device of Viktor Shklovsky. It's unimaginable. So you see, in fact, I think the world is much richer than mere diagrams. And as I suggested, the idea of modernity, you see, I would say it even more. The idea of modernity is the idea of time. And I only learned recently how you pronounce time in Russian, which is very different from all other European languages in which the Latin root is kept, but in Russian time is another word, another world. And I don't know, nobody knows exactly when the idea of time actually was invented by human beings. What we do know, you mentioned the Old Testament, what we do know is the idea of time as historical, as a narrative, is a very late idea relatively. It appears first time, according to some accounts of Momeliano, for example, in the late book of the Old Testament, the book of Prophet Daniel, who was acting in exile. So in exile, he could not follow the idea of the eternal reoccurrence, as Nietzsche favored so much in the 19th century, as a reaction to historicism, right? Daniel invented the idea that the past will not repeat itself in the future, that the future will be otherwise. There will be another kingdom, and this kingdom will come to an end, and then we will return home. Well, it meant that the first time the idea of history as a movement. Now, in your own culture, there is a monumental testimony to such speculation in the work of Klebnikov, Vladimir Klebnikov, in his Tables of Time. He is a clear man who thought clearly about it insofar as a poetic invention of time. I'm sure that Tatlin Tower and all the rest would not be conceivable without Klebnikov's speculations. You know, in the two books also translated to English, you know, the King of Time and the Train. His inventions are so profound because they also affected the idea of materiality, the Zaum idea that any phonemes can acquire meaning, provided that you know how to use it, like in Smeka Smekana, the famous poem. That is also reflected in the reliefs of Tatlin, the use of industrial material and so on. So you see here at once that our entire standing in the world and our relationship to materiality and construction and so on depends on, if that depends on single something, I would say they are completely dependent on our invention of temporality, of time. I would say that every work of art has its own field of time. Of course, the greater the work, the more its individuality in terms of temporality will be even greater. But the idea that we are responsible is a great idea. And I think that being such a, in many ways, profoundly Christian country, I would add that Jesus himself I would regard as the first modernist. Why the first modernist? Because he said simply, if all is written is true and good, then why should it not happen in my time, what the German called the Jetztzeit? Now time is a very tricky concept. And Jews actually clearly was saying it. Insofar as he said it, he was both modern and romantic. I mean, it's hardly possible to be, in my view, modern without being romantic, or to be romantic without being modern. So I don't think that, you know, our colleague here suggested that they died in 1980. Maybe something died in 1980, something dying all the time. But I don't think that the idea of modernity died, because the idea of modernity is associated with awareness that time is in your own hands, and you can invent it, reinvent it, you can make it. I mean, theoretically, it was not very clear before the late 19th century, only with people like Proust, with Einstein, with Freud, with Henri Bergson, the idea that you can invent your time came about. And indeed, many geometries are just as invented as time. And the geometries that we did have, like non-Euclidean geometries, until relativity, there was no physical interpretation. It was regarded as mere speculation. And the people who invented it, like Lubachevsky, Gauss, and so on, felt very uncomfortable. They didn't know exactly what they invented, and they didn't know. Just as mathematicians, many mathematicians like Cantor, when he invented most important moments, equation of infinity, etc., he had to go to the sanatorium because there was no place for it in the world as he knew it. So, of course, there is something very threatening about the true idea of modernity is a very threatening idea, because it suggests that what is not necessarily what it is, and could be otherwise. And the idea that everything could be otherwise, this is what I think is one of the characteristics of it. And of course, as it's already mentioned by Sergei, that there were moments in which there was a big debate between the modern and ancient, and the most memorable reply to it was Evermond, given in the 12th century already, that we of course are inferior to the ancient. But if the ancient were the giants, we are the dwarfs on the shoulder of a giant, and therefore we have the potential of being even greater. And I think that clever answer is a very clever answer, but you can see that it was put again in terms of successive temporalities. And I think that it's difficult to measure how much Nietzsche's speculation in the late 19th century affected such a thinker as Proust. Freud certainly was affected, but Nietzsche tried to overcome historicism and the historical dimension by going back to the eternal reoccurrence, and he wrote very much about it in Engaged Science and so on. The idea the Greek and Roman had no idea of time as a movement, linear movement. It was circular, and what will be is either was a season or it was like the metallic changes. But what the past was always deemed to be the future, and it was meant to repeat itself endlessly. You could say painful idea. But this was the idea of Nietzsche, which helped many to relieve themselves from this. And indeed, Corbusier was a great admirer of Nietzsche, Das Volk Zarathustra. He was a great admirer of Don Quixote, of Cervantes, so much so that when his favorite dog died, his dog was called Pansé, the brush, and when he died, he stripped the skin, the fair skin, and made of it a cover for his volume of Cervantes. So, between Cervantes and Nietzsche, there is no time. Because if Cervantes teaches you anything, it's not what you are taught in school about medieval, the ridiculousness of repeating medieval canons. No, it was the Old Testament and New Testament that he made fun of, that you cannot live according to a book. And modernity teaches you above all that you cannot live according to a book. In other words, that you have to invent just about everything. And I think this idea is still powerful, even though socially, culturally, sometimes it is much depressed. But this is the story of every culture. In Chinese culture, you have the same. You have Lao Tzu at the same time as Confucius. So you have a kind of more classical point of view against more romantic, radical point of view. And you have it up and down, up and down. I remember that when Zhou Enlai, who was the foreign minister of Mao Zedong, was asked what did he think of the French Revolution, he said, it's far too early to judge. Well, you see, different cultures have totally different ideas of time, and perspective of time can alter so completely dramatically that it's very difficult to predict what will be tomorrow. But I think I'll stop here because otherwise I can go on for the rest of the afternoon.
Can I have do you call modernity with modernism? Because for me it's not the same.
Yes, you're right. Yes, that's a good distinction, of course. Yes, I would agree with the distinction. Yeah.
So you were talking about modernity.
I was talking about the idea of the modern, you know, from Cassiodoro's first use of it is of the time. Cassiodorus was a priest in a Roman monastery in the north of Rome in 4th century, just after the fall of Rome. And I think for him, the importance of time now was in contrast with the fact that the Roman Empire was no longer. And so that is, I would say that, again, I'm talking ahistorically, and now I introduce an element of historical. But so, you know, history, that's the very word, you know, you use the word also in Russian, historia.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a Greek word. And what it meant in Greek, you would be surprised probably, it meant simply an inquiry. It did not have any temporal dimension. People wrote histories in Greek time in order to tell you, you know, to give you evidence of what happened so that you can learn from this experience of war and strife and so on, how to behave in the future. But there was no idea of future in these inquiries. They became history in our sense very late. Perhaps you could say that in complete, well, of course, from Judaism into Christianity, the transition was fairly, you know, terribly long, you could say. It took hundreds of years. And in fact, the idea of history as we understand it in this kind of Hegelian fashion, and most people are Hegelian even without knowing it, it comes from Giambattista Vico, who wrote in the 1751, in the 18th century, he wrote his most important book, which is Scienza Nova, the new science. And what was the new science? The new science was history. And there you already have this idea of the spiral, that time moves in spiral, the kind of spiral that you find in much of 20th century art and modernity. Tatlin, the tower is a spiral in some senses. And indeed, every part of the tower was meant to move in a different time scale of months and day and week and so on. But of course, there was no way to build it. So, okay. Well,
and I would like to say that I think there is no modern architecture at all, because as soon as the building builds, it is already materializing the ideas that were 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. So, and I found it when I was doing quite a big project, which was sort of lasting for about 3 years, and by the time it was built, I would rebuild it anew, which means that that architecture as a material piece is not modern ever. But what is modern is the use of the architecture, because and the architect, the best architect, can predict how the architecture will be used. And in this way, modernism is also sort of a shape which reacted to the changes which were made in the language. And what I think what is happening, for example, now in Russia is firstly the change of the language, because when Khlyebnikov wrote his poems, obviously the folk language was alive, and there was this habit of simple people inventing words. And that was taken as a method and then realized in a poetic form. And only then, with this reaction to the surrounding, started the change of architecture, and first art and only then architecture, because maybe it started first in art, like the Apia, Adolf Apia drawings, and Malevich, and Krutchony, who actually did the first suprematism collages before Malevich. So, and what's happening now in Russia, that this, as in my understanding, that this sort of language environment is so poor that the language we use now doesn't describe the reality we have. And so, I don't know, maybe 70% of the events we have now are not described in language at all, so we are not conscious. And this is why maybe these historical styles, they come back, because somehow they give this foundation for, I don't know, for new, is the new ideology, or somehow it supports this lack of understanding the reality. And in this sense, modernism, like Soviet modernism, it was looking in the future, but at the same time it was already past when it was built. I don't know, what can I say?
You just pointed out that words like modern and new are one of the most slippery words it is,
yeah.
You know, because, yes, of course, and we can talk about Vita Nova, about Italian Renaissance, yes, and I'm not sure that it's very fruitful approach. And another thing you just said, that what is really new, it's new uses, and architect cannot dictate uses. And this idea is postmodern. Postmodern, because modernist architects, especially constructivists, but also even in post-war decades, they saw they could program, yes, form follow function and so on. Yes, it's one of the most important maxims, and it's out of date now.
Well, may I react?
Yeah.
I would probably disagree. I think Gleb has raised a very important issue here about the advocacy between description and the reality. I mean, reality is also a slippery word, of course. But what I would probably not agree with in what Anna just said is that in the beginning modernists were planning people's lives, let's say. For me, and we thought of shifting to discussing Arthur Flows as one of the founding figures. When we look at him, it's in fact not really clear whether he was a progressive or a kind of aristocratic conservative. And this is true also for people like Karl Kraus, for example, to whom he was close, who actually shifted in his life course from very kind of, well, Nietzsche himself, is he progressive or conservative?
Not egalitarian.
What?
Not egalitarian.
Not egalitarian. Yes, and Laws, of course, was not. Again, this is also tackles very slippery, ambiguous, and important also issue of relation of modernism to political agenda, realm of political ideas. But I think in the beginning there were actually aesthetic intuitions in the first place. And Егуда has mentioned Husserl, who was founder of phenomenology. And to me, what's most important in Husserl is this demand for actually maintaining knowledge in what he calls an active state. He actually distinguishes between two different conditions of knowledge and thinking. On one hand, there could be a kind of, let's say, false, automatic, mechanical way of thinking, which is relying on books from previous generations, for example, or on other kind of frameworks, let's say that, dogmas. And an active state is, like how I explain it to me, is, for example, when you know what Pythagoras' theorem says, you should be able to actually prove it yourself. You cannot rely on proofs that were made before you. And in everything else, the same. And actually, civilization produces this masses of, well, statements that we have to take without, for granted, let's say. And this is what makes our conditions of our existence really, really kind of fast. And for me, in modernism, in the first place, there was this, let's say, rebellion against this falseness of conditions. And this is, I think, who else should be mentioned here? Of course, Heidegger, with his main thesis of oblivion of being, of kind of true being. On the other hand, early Wittgenstein, who actually came up with the idea of this very much resonates with what Gleb said, of a language which is actually purified from all sorts of, let's say, speculative statements. Language that could, which could be able to support life in its kind of very material and spatial and tactile sense and quality, like reality itself. And therefore, he said, we have to get rid of philosophy altogether. So which is, and this, I think, very much a modernist agenda in the beginning. Then we could also notice that probably there was a kind of romantic beginning of modernism, and then there was a kind of classicist end. Then it became a dogma itself to a certain extent.
And very,
I mean,
very commercial.
That's what Lowe said about the Bauhaus, that they made the lack of ornament into a new kind of ornament. So, but I don't think that it's very helpful to describe Lowe as a conservative. Also, the word conservative is very ambiguous, because it's just like modernity. I mean, there were Ernst Jünger certainly was a modernist, but of a different kind.
Different for laws.
A different kind, I think. I didn't go into details. But, and everybody read Jünger at the time, the Arbeiter was a book that Mies van der Rohe read. But you see, even Mies van der Rohe was caught in this time problem, because he speaks on a few occasions, as you know, he hasn't written much, but on a few occasions that he has written, he suggested that there was some such thing as zeitgeist, and that the architect has to respond to it, which I think is an optical illusion, forgetting that it is the architect, it is the poet to decide what is the time in which we live. So it gives a kind of false comfort to the architect or the poet to think that he is expressing the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time. This is a kind of terrible Hegelianism. I never really understood how come that Mies didn't get rid of it, especially when his great client, the first client of his, was the greatest authority in Berlin at the time on Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. And that helped him a lot. But somehow he managed to sneak in this idea of spirit of the time. I don't think there is such a thing as spirit of the time. I think that the poets, the writers, the architects, they decide in what time we live, and they actually create what eventually and retrospectively people recognize as the spirit of the time. But I don't think that this Hegelian folly is. I think it's just a chimera. And so I think that you also mentioned Krauss as a possible candidate for conservatism. And I don't think it's helpful. I think that I think that somebody like Karl Kraus was well above this kind of distinctions. well above also the opposition between materialism and idealism. This distinction didn't make much sense to these people. And indeed, in Husserl philosophy, as you probably know, this distinction is completely have been overcome. And Wittgenstein is a parallel line, but complex. I mean, his idea, and to put it together, I didn't like the idea of putting him so near to Heidegger, because I think it's... and Heidegger, yes, was a student of Husserl, but he turned him upside down. It's a bit like Marx and Hegel, you know. Husserl, as a philosopher, was after the essence of things, and Heidegger was not. He was after the existence, you know. And indeed, his great work, Being and Time. And whose time is it in Being and Time? I can tell you, because he tells you in the book himself. He says that from a point of view of history and so on, you should read Marx. That's what he says. I mean, just look at the index under Marx, and you will find this. You will find this direct reference. So Heidegger, for me, is dreadful news. And indeed, when the Nazi came to power, he thought that the spirit was speaking to him. He became a Nazi and was the rector of the university for a year. Then he realized, you know what he realized? When I was a student, I thought he realized what a terrible thing it was. But then I found out that no, the Nazis were not radical enough for him, you see. And then he resigned. Not because he found out how terrible it was. It was not just not terrible enough. So I wouldn't put all these people in one sack, as it were, you know. I think, you know, indeed, Wittgenstein is best known for his, you could say, speculation on language, the language game, the idea that language consists of a language game. But in reality, I think there is a parallel, indeed, between Wittgenstein and Husserl, insofar as they look at everyday life. But Wittgenstein understood language as a form of life, hence whatever human activities are, make the language what it is, giving the possibility of meanings. So, you know, in the West there is no theory of meaning that people can ascribe to. Meaning is that which is created, you could say ad hoc, rather than in any abstract way. And I think the issues are quite open. And I think that modernity is so, how should we say, I think it's always urgent, because whenever people realize that that unless we rely on a dogmatic kind of type of knowledge, we do not have anything that we can trust. I mean, Wittgenstein, in the last sentence, and the only book that he published in his lifetime, in fact, was the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And there, in the last page, he says, and the most important thing, we cannot speak, and therefore, on that which we cannot speak, we must remain silent. So, that's not very helpful.
Not very helpful?
Not very helpful.
I'm just short comment. I'm very grateful to your advisement, who, like recently in one of the texts we published in Project International, kind of uncovered the story of architectural influences in Wittgenstein very early during the First World War. He says he actually probably that was the beginning of this path in philosophy. Then he discovered a kind of report of a trial that was held in Paris about the car accident. And then he learned from the newspaper that a model of the territory of the crossroad was used in order to kind of figure out exactly how things have happened. And then he realized the distance between language and reality we work with as architects.
I don't understand why you should go to such a incidental thing. The most important thing in this respect in Wittgenstein's experience was building the house for his sister. And
yes.
I think that is
later.
Yeah, but that is the moment of transition, because the Tractatus was written before the First World War, was not published, but was written before. That was his thesis. He spent the war with the Tractatus in his sack. And then it was published thanks to the introduction of Russell, and then his sister suggested to him that he could build a house for her. And he began to design it with the students of Adolf Loos called Paul Engelmann. But then Paul Engelmann realized that Michelin wanted to control everything, from detail to the volumes and so on. And so he withdrew. And in my interpretation, and some people agree with me, this period in which he was the site architect, he was there on the site, he realized that the meaning is not transmitted purely by language, it's transmitted because of what he called life forms. And that's what he writes about subsequently. And I think that experience really altered his conception of language. And he moved into this idea of language games only subsequently, after he finished building.
Well, language games, of course, but you already quoted his last sentence from the data. So that's about the limitations of language.
Yeah, that is an earlier text.
Can I just add? Sorry. Can I just add that the importance of Husserl for Russian avant-garde was that much that firstly in his philosophy he applied to the visual experience, and the ideology of the idea of phenomenology. The first foreign language it was translated to was Russian. It was made by Spetz in 1908, and Spetz was a close friend with Jakobson and Khrushchev. So, and Malevich knew German language as well. So, just by reading the later text of Malevich, I found that there is a lot of correspondence with Husserl, the idea of phenomenology and the origin of geometry, two texts. And so, but I think it was the strong influence was this idea that what we see is the phenomena that we cannot change and we have to take for granted. And this idea of what we see basically lies in the idea of modernism. Because in the origin of geometry, Husserl comes to Plato and square as one of the main forms, and so also the color, the red color, and there are even direct correspondence between the pictures of Malevich and texts of Husserl, and it's amazing. And at a certain time, Malevich stopped drawing, he started to write, and then he again in about 1935 started to draw, but a bit differently.
I'm sure that what you're saying is true, but the reference to the origin of geometry is false, because the origin of geometry was written very late. In 1930s.
Yes, but there is an interesting connection of origin of geometry to Jakobson, because it was written after Husserl met Jakobson in Prague, and after the text of Jakobson on folk art. And so there was an intersection, and then somehow it returned, and then the pictures of Malevich with these peasants appeared.
No, it's well established that Russian formalists would have not ever cared without Husserl phenomenology, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But that particular reference to geometry is something more complex, it come later.
Yeah.
Because you see, in the early 20th century, there were a lot of people, including the greatest French mathematician Poincaré, who believed that no matter what other geometries there would be, Euclidean geometry will remain superior and overwhelmingly important. And indeed, that's one of the reasons he couldn't reach the conclusion that Einstein did, only not very long after. So the issue of the status of such things was very, very important. But Husserl came to it only late in his life, and this essay is important in that sense that it argues that surely there could be many other geometries, and surely nobody can decide in advance what kind of a world will be revealed as a result of these geometries. And that's why it's such a formidable little text. And indeed, Derrida's first important work in this field was a translation of this text with an introduction that is 4 times longer than the original text. Maybe because it's so difficult to understand, I think. So that's the story of the original geometry. 1930.
May also join the discussion. And I'd like to return to title of our discussion, because all the speeches are dedicated to the past of modernism.
No,
But it's interesting because we are talking about Wittgenstein, Husserl, and so on. But what happens now? I think it's very interesting because if we're speaking, as Gleb mentioned, that we're speaking of description of contemporary, of how to describe the contemporary world, the actual world. What terminology we should use for this? I mean, in architectural terms, because if we're actually the reality. I'm sorry for using this word, but I don't know other one. If we're describing the actual reality, we have nothing to. We have no foundation right now. Unfortunately, because if we're looking, okay, not to the Old Testament or to Jesus, but to the very particular time of when the modernistic language of which was invented, the beginning of the last century. It was the very general movement in all arts and in all intellectual spheres. So it was architecture finally was based on invention of cubism and of suprematism and all other art trends of that time, as well as formalistic philology and so on. If we look at contemporary time, okay, let's speak of art after philosophy. Let's speak about Joseph Koshut and of conceptual art, which has no formal language finally. So we are living in the world where there is no formal language of contemporary time. So it is very interesting phenomena, which never happened in the world history, because always architecture was supported, or at least somehow connected to visual arts. So somehow, I can hardly believe that parametric architecture follows any philosophy.
I agree.
You agree? Okay. So I just provoke you to comment this.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, not only you're right, but what you're saying also touches on very important distinctions, and most people are completely ignorant of it. For example, the question of Vienna. People think that somehow magically Vienna, early 20th century, they all were friends and they all did similar things. No, there was a huge schism. And the schism has to do with this conceptual aspect as opposed to the formal and sensual. For example, the secessionists, to whom laws objected so much in so many ways, epistemologically, they were following the epistemology of Ernst Mach. Everybody knows Mach because of the speed of sound, but Mach had a philosophy, had epistemology, and Mach believed that all knowledge comes from the senses. So much so that when the relativity paper was published, Mach was against it. Was against it because there was no empirical proof, as it were, right? And Lowe's, with very little knowledge of physics, actually wrote a review of one of Mach's books, which was a book about errors, And interesting, precisely because of this point, because conceptually, Lowe's was much more relying on a conceptual argument rather than formal, rather than merely kind of pictorial. And he was against, he was so much against Henri van der Velde that he said famously once that in the future a prison sentence will be incomplete without a cell being designed by Henri van der Velde. Why was he particularly so harsh on van der Velde? I think also because he was jealous that Henri van der Velde had a personal connection with Nietzsche, something that he didn't have, right? Because Henri van der Velde built in Weimar days today, it was restored, his monument and library, thanks to Count Kessler. Count Kessler introduced Henri van der Velde to Nietzsche and his sister in Weimar in the last years of his life. But this connection, I'm sure, inspired Loos to be particularly harsh on Henri van der Velde. But in general, it kind of dramatized the real conflict, which is around the issue that you have raised, around the issue of, I would put it like this, the conceptual as opposed to the phenomenal, the phenomenal of the phenomenalism of the secession was completely rejected by Loos, and made him a little bit of a pariah in relation to the secessionists. And so I think the conceptualist is just another version of modernity that is not easy to assimilate, precisely because when you design, no matter how conceptual you are, you have to give it some form and some kind of material expression.
May I support the theme that Eugen has turned up, the modern state of architecture. If we will speak of parametric architecture and what is happening at the moment, I think it's the result of the age of structuralism in architecture, when the architects were looking for scientific methods of designing architecture. In a way, they tried to make it look as a result of a scientific research. So the architects, instead of just, maybe that was because the loss of the authority of architect as a talent. It was a cultural change in attitude to the architect, and that was also the result of mass-produced housing. So that meant that this tradition of becoming scientific is developing, and this parametric architecture we have now the computers, they prove the results of an architect. So, and if you will see how the modern fashionable projects are presented, they are always presented as a sequence of different drawings showing how you would take one part and then it transforms or somehow it's shaped from the circumstances. So it's like an objective criteria which is proposed instead of the subjective criteria, the talent, the beauty, the harmony, which is actually quite subjective.
Well, may I comment a little bit?
Yeah.
Evgeny also raised this question of references directed from contemporary architecture to visual arts. And I think the result of, let's say, what Frank Gehry does, and then this parametric architecture as a kind of, trail, they very much referred to abstract expressionism, which is kind of very late reference to my mind, but it's, how it relates to, let's say, Loos' discussion with secessionists, I think it's precisely the same kind of issue. What is being done in parametrism is a kind of, let's say, simulation or modeling of what should stand for a kind of expression of creative freedom. But it's not real freedom, it's a kind of simulation, in fact. And this is, I think, exactly what Loos was against in case of Van der Velde or Albrecht. And what he was writing in his funny issue essay called "Poor Little Rich Man."
Yeah.
Then,
that was more against the Gesamtkunstwerke.
So parametrism is today's Art Nouveau, and we need new modernism.
Yeah, the poor rich man, it was an argument against Gesamtkunstwerke, where architects and clients were expecting that every detail in their interior would be.
Well, may I also something? To my mind, what modernism is conceptual from the beginning, in the sense that it has, it aims at kind of not like dissolving itself or ourselves in a kind of open aesthetics, but he argues for like reflecting on the border between two realms, let's say, the realm of let's say organizing life, like practically organizing, and the realm of let's say sensation, ecstasies, and things like that. So modernism from the beginning tries to establish. No, it doesn't try to kind of express this kind of ultimate aesthetic freedom, but it tries to make architecture a kind of frame for it. And this is very much what the late conceptual art is about. Late conceptual art is also not about just, let's say, purely intellectual concepts. It's about seeing the border between concept and sensual perception. And actually, what conceptual does, it makes us reflect on, let's say, models and abstract ideas that govern our thinking, and to sort of separate them from aesthetic perception and, let's say, feeling. And so the art, let's say, the collective action group art here in Moscow, this is a kind of unofficial group. It is aimed at kind of precisely at creating windows in our practically organized life for this kind of pure, emancipated aesthetic existence, or perceptions, or переживания. What's the word?
Sensation.
Emotions.
Emotion. Perception.
Переживания.
Oh, but okay. It's interesting how in contemporary conceptual art and architecture this phenomenological approach is combined with the conceptual approach.
Yes,
so in a way, you know, I suppose that it's my practice. So that's the best way. In the best way, it is combined in minimalistic.
Not necessarily.
But it's my feeling.
Oh, right.
Okay.
But like Mr. Hall is not a minimalist, but you could say that his approach is very phenomenological in the empirical sense, you know, more like Merleau-Ponty than in the conceptual sense. But, for example, Aldo Rossi was very close to Italian phenomenologist called Enzo Paci. And Enzo Paci's specialty was not the empirical phenomenology of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. The specialty of Enzo Paci was the conceptual, it was the epoche. And what is the epoche? The epoche is what every good artist does, meaning that you reject the world as it is shown by others, and you say, just a moment, let me see. To me, it looks quite different. And that is the epoche, it's a phenomenological reduction, the stepping back. And, you know, some Dutch speculator once coined it very beautifully, said that every painter is a born phenomenologist. He doesn't know that he's a phenomenologist, but he has to be. So there are different kinds of phenomenology, you see, and I think there's a huge confusion now. Peter Eisenman is one of the people who promote this confusion. You know, he calls the people who talk about sense perception and materiality and so on, he called them the phenomenologists, as opposed to the conceptualists, right? So he is the conceptual, right? But in fact, he doesn't realize, though he had friendship with Derrida, but I don't think he ever understood Derrida, because he didn't read anything before Derrida. You know, he doesn't appreciate that there is no phenomenology without conceptual approach. So the conceptualists are phenomenologists in their way, and those other people, and he has a short list of these people that I know personally, none of them are phenomenologists, but they talk about qualities of material, like,
Roughness.
Schultz, Norwegian Schultz, Norman Schultz, like in Rietveld in London, But Rietveld, I was his student, he never was a phenomenologist. He's not interested in that. But for Mr. Eisenman, there are the phenomenologists, because he wants to put himself in a distance. You see, so first of all, I would say that there is not one kind of phenomenology, there are different kinds. There are conceptual, more kind of radical empiricism, like Maurice Merleau-Ponty and so on. And I think therefore there is a confusion about it. But the important thing is not who is phenomenologist, who is not. The important thing is exactly the issue that you raised. What is the role in conceptual thinking when it comes to architecture? And how does it serve us? And I think it serves us directly because whatever people have, whatever commitment people have to material or use of material or construction of it, it is based on some concept of which they are sometimes aware and sometimes not even aware. And therefore, whatever conceptual approach there is, it's very important. Most of the people who were under the constructivist exhibition of Mr. Eisenman, because he is the one who initiated, had no idea of phenomenology or deconstruction as a theoretical terms. No idea. Frank Gehry certainly not. And Zaha Hadid, she studied mathematics before she studied architecture in the American University in Beirut, and she was terribly intelligent and terribly well educated. But she had no idea about these things. I think the only people who knew something was Libeskind, Peter in this way, Brehm certainly wasn't aware. I mean, most of the seven, Bernard Tschumi only by name. I mean, he made the introduction, when he had La Villette project, he had this brilliant idea of, he said to himself, why not get one of the key intellectuals in Paris, like Derrida, and meet him together with Eisenman. So he didn't know Derrida especially, but he thought as a man about town, the man who has this important project, he's in good position to make a phone call and to introduce himself, and he did. And I talked to him, I asked him, I want to know how all this happened, And he said, well, I called Derrida and I suggested that I would introduce him to Eisenman. He knew Eisenman. And that's how it happened. Except that when Eisenman and Derrida met together, that gave enough energy or enough whatever to Eisenman to invent bombastic project. It had to be rejected at the outset.
Well, is it true that Gehry and Tschumi then distanced themselves from this label of deconstructionism?
No. Nobody cares if somebody gives you a label and it seems to work and helpful to you in your career, you won't reject it. I mean, most of the painters' labels came after the event, and sometimes there were labels that were negative that they turned into positive, like the Impressionists. The Impressionist was a term of abuse by the critic. They described these painter Impressionists in order to put them down. And they gradually managed to turn it around. It's rare. The futurists were one of the only movement that started with a manifesto.
With the self-identification.
Exactly. And Marinetti was lucky because the father of his wife was no less than the proprietor of Le Figaro. So when he published the pamphlet, it was published front page on Figaro. Can you imagine? I mean, Le Figaro is still today a major paper. And that's how the whole thing started. So the futurists, they join in under a title. But most of the movement's title comes after. Cubist. Who invented Cubist, Not Picasso, not Braque. Apollinaire, who was a poet friend, he called them Cubist after the event. So, you see, most movements are called after the events, and deconstruction is also called after the event. None of the people who projected the projects in the famous exhibition actually knew what deconstruction was, except Libeskind. Probably, yeah. He's a very intelligent man, well read. Unfortunately, didn't keep his
natural.
Because he's so intelligent.
And may I again return to modern times? Because we have parametric architecture at the moment, which is sort of everywhere.
What do you mean we have? Some people...
No, well, okay, I mean in the media.
No.
But at the same time, just thinking recently of what's going on, I for me, formulated such a term, maybe I am wrong, which I called a modern Neolithic.
Neolithic.
When, if you will take, for example, the chapel that Zumthor did with this fire, in a way it's returning to this sort of Neolithic roots of instinct of construction. There is no logical chain of building up. And I see also watching what some of the students, for example, of the first year of MARSH are doing for this year with this personal what's the word, ritual. I thought that this is a bit like Neolithic. It's like the architecture there is somehow it's not logical, it's not structural, but it expresses the deeper feelings of a non-professional. And I think this is the way, one of the interesting ways in which architecture may develop at the moment. And this is quite a good alternative to this computerized, analogous, digital world. Because also we just discussed with Sergey that this physical labor in architecture, maybe with robotization, will become much more important because it will be the way for people to occupy themselves, like building a house for yourself. It will be not a hard work, but it will be a way of educating yourself and developing you physically. And because obviously the mind very much depends on your movements and how precise they are. Because it's very important when a child grows. Yeah, this tactile experience, and also it's very important for people. It's also very important for the elderly people, for example, because there are ways of rehabilitation by physical labor. And I think maybe that might be one of the interesting directions of where the architecture is going to.
But this dream was already rehearsed by Constant in a project called Babylon. And Babylon was meant to be built by people who had leisure on their hands. And after a while he realized that nothing of this will happen, so he turned to his original occupation, which was as a painter, and he painted the people, according to him, who would live in this Babylon. And that was very depressing.
But again, I didn't know, but I think there was an idea of imposing an idea on the society, of putting them together and building this Babylon. But if it will be happening just occasionally in different places, like and with no control, it will be a bit different, because it's again the idea of building a city on one principle is a bit.
You're building a contradiction in your argument, because
okay.
if it's going to happen just because it happened, then you don't need the architect. You cannot have you cannot have it both ways. You can't have the architect planning.
Yeah, exactly.
Thing and then
that's what I'm leading to, because maybe we are having an appearance of new vernacular, because in the vernacular architecture you would have a builder with experience, but he was not an architect. But at the same time he had certain skills to do this, and certain aesthetics which he would follow. So maybe
you see,
this
is obviously a possibility, but we're not. Then, in my view, at that point, you're no longer talking about architecture.
Okay.
I mean, people can play all sorts of games, but it's not chess. If you play chess, you play chess, and there are certain rules of the game. And I think architecture is much richer and wider than just a game of chess. But it is a language. It is a language that within that language you must be able to create more options. But you cannot, it's not an option to say that let's not use the language. Right? In that case you are not in that language, so you are talking about something else. You're talking about life, you're talking about what's good for people, how to occupy themselves. But then we are not talking about, in my view, we are not talking about architecture, we are talking about other kind of problems. And there are plenty of problems, as we know, in every society, which relatively kind of touch on architecture, but architecture is not in the center of all that. Nor is it affected by it so clearly. I think that ultimately the best of architecture is affected by the best of architecture.
Full stop is a good end.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and actually, by the time, I don't know.
Well, maybe we should discuss something
Yeah.
with the audience.
Yeah.
There's any questions
Are there any questions or comments or
concerning
statements?
modernity?
Actually, I have a comment, maybe, while you ask about your question. I think that, still, I believe that we live in the condition of postmodernity. And modernism, okay, he continues to be, and sometimes architects manage to build very beautiful modernist objects, like you. And no, false. But it's only one of the options.
It's a logo.
Yes,
You have to admit it.
and the most important thing that's happening now, that now each of us spend a lot of time in virtual reality. So what we want from physical reality is a bit different. And maybe I think that one of the most fruitful approaches, what I'm not saying that I'm a great fan of raмках, but I think that idea of doing almost nothing is a good one. When you take existing
Don't
structure,
worry, it's not its original invention.
yeah, okay,
Yeah,
maybe, but still, yes, we have enough structures already that could be reprogrammed. And in new construction, I think that it has been influenced by this maybe more acute desire for sensations. I mean, not visual. At the same time, it should be polite. You know, we have to take new ethics into consideration. This desire to stop all aggression or gender suppression and so on. It should be polite and should not cry loud. And I think that parametric architecture has its last days already. So it should have maybe interesting structure or give us tactile and pleasant climate, but it mustn't shout and it mustn't take too much of our attention, because our attention is exhausted by what we get through these devices and something similar.
But what convinced you that you live in a post-modern, especially when we have never been modern?
Yeah.
Well, because for a period of time people believed that they can build a better future, and now we live in a period of disappointment, of a period that many called post-truth, in a period of very unpleasant political drawbacks in almost every country,
But how do you
except Canada.
That's again just a period.
But how do you
Yes, it's a period, and modernism, yes, maybe, okay, let's return to this theory of wave. Maybe this modernity which started in the 4th century AD, maybe in this sense it will have another new life. Yes,
No, but I don't
probably,
understand what
but
is
not modernist architecture as we know it in the 20th century.
What this the political disappointment has to do with modernity in architecture. I don't see this connection.
Well, modernist architecture is optimistic and it believed in future.
Not necessarily.
Architecture always is optimistic. It can hardly be pessimistic.
You can't build without
It's important to have in mind that even if laws, of course, very ambiguous in this terms. And if we take even our Russian constructivists like OSA magazine, right? The Общество современных архитектурных Society of Contemporary Architects. Their functional method, what they called, was kind of very consciously devoid of any kind of utopian overtones, utopian political overtones. There was a famous kind of collision. Then there was a social revolutionary critic who has written a letter to OSA, and he said, well, functional method is very good, but what about our revolutionary dreams? What about the spirit of our age? The spirit of proletarians? And they kind of, I mean, it was like 1927, something like that, and they were very clear. We don't want to accept these things in our architecture. It's not about expression of revolutionary spirit. It's not about, it's about everyday life. It's about how to make today's life more convenient and more actually real.
Yes, but they were given the possibility to create that.
Well, then they were refused this possibility, and precisely because probably
No. They were given the possibility to create this ordinary life as they see fit.
You mean like Ginsburg on Kommune or something like that? That was an experiment, let's say. There were a few of these experiments, in fact. And when we think about the industrial housing, I don't think it's this kind of direct continuation of what they were talking also magazine.
So, and if we'll speak of industrial housing, we come to the point that in the end, you cannot build good architecture without good architects. So in a way, it's very personal. So,
but it's an interesting question, of course, this connection with political agenda.
Political, economical, also, and others.
yes.
All others.